A violent father, a son that yearned for more, and an innocent woman caught in the middle of it all. These are just some of the details that make the Buchanan family triple homicide one of the most tragic cases we've ever looked at. But the tragedy's made even more potent by how complicated everything is. The people involved were 38-year-old Adam Buchanan, his son, 16-year-old Nolan Buchanan, his fiancée, 37-year-old Molly McAfee, and their son and Nolan's half-brother, 8-year-old Gavin. Most of the members of this family were found beneath the smoking rubble of a dilapidated forest cabin, one that the Buchanans had hoped to fix up into something beautiful. In many ways, this forest cabin represented everything the Buchanans dreamed of. The fact that it became their final resting place after they were brutally murdered is ironic and makes this incident all the more tragic. Today, we'll unpack the details behind the last weekend of the Buchanan family and the series of events that led to their horrific deaths. Nolan Keith Buchanan was born in 1999 in Benicia, California, to Adam Buchanan. His birth mother's name hasn't been released to the public, and reports indicate she wasn't in the picture much. It's possible that she was simply too young to be a mother, since Adam himself was just 21 when his son was born. As we'll soon reveal, Adam also had a violent streak that may have pushed Nolan's birth mother away. Regardless, Adam raised Nolan on his own for a few years. By all accounts, he was a hard man who had a very strict view of masculinity and expected his son to adhere to it without question. This likely had a negative impact on Nolan's mental health growing up. In 2005, Adam started up his own construction business called Buchanan & Sons, intending to pass the business down to Nolan when he was old enough. The business did very well for some time, and Adam was able to save up a healthy nest egg. About a year after setting up shop, business was booming to the point where Adam couldn't manage everything himself anymore. He needed an office manager, so he put out an ad which received a few responses. One of the people that responded was Molly McAfee, who was 27 at the time. She came in for an interview and sparks flew. Adam and Molly had undeniable chemistry, but they kept things professional for the moment. Suffice it to say, she got the job and ran Buchanan & Sons like a well-oiled machine. It was only a matter of time before Adam's charm started to work on Molly. He was apparently very charismatic when he wanted to be, and pretty soon Molly was swept off her feet. It appeared to be a wholesome, healthy relationship, with Molly quickly becoming the mother that Nolan never had. Nolan was still just 7 years old when his father and Molly started dating in 2006. It's possible that he didn't even remember his birth mother, and Molly raised him as her own son. The three were a perfect family for a time, sharing much joy, with a lot of that coming from Molly. She's been described as a very positive, cheerful person who'd do anything to create a loving family environment. Adam and Molly didn't waste any time before expanding their family. In 2007, they had another son named Gavin, and Nolan finally had a little brother to play with. Gavin was an absolute darling of the Benicia community, with a particular love for dogs. In fact, when he was just 5 years old, he donated all the money he got from his allowance and from doing chores to the local K-9 task force. Despite what you may expect, Nolan didn't seem to have been jealous of Gavin at all. If we go by appearances only, he was a doting older brother who loved taking care of Gavin any chance he got. However, there was something dark lurking in his mind, something that he rarely ever revealed. Even though he seemed to love his brother, deep down, he was jealous and afraid. You see, Nolan had felt a lot of pressure from his father throughout his life. Adam expected Nolan to do all the chores, and he always seemed to have a problem with how he did them. Whenever he was displeased with Nolan, he'd immediately insult him by saying that he wasn't a man. This belittlement only got worse as time went on, and Nolan eventually began to resent his father. Now, some reports suggest that Adam was a lot softer with Gavin. It's possible that this was due to him being a lot younger, but Nolan had been mistreated for as long as he could remember. Watching his father verbally abuse him only to turn around and coddle his younger brother potentially created a twisted hatred in Nolan's heart. This hatred would eventually burrow its way out of him and erupt in a violent frenzy that would leave the entire family dead. Of course, it's fair to say that Nolan had a very good teacher when it came to violence. After all, based on Molly's own accounts, Adam could be a very abusive man. He even hit her on multiple occasions, and there's some evidence to suggest that he became violent towards Gavin before the end as well. He was, at the very least, very controlling about Gavin. Since sometimes Molly wanted to go and stay with her mother, he apparently didn't allow her to take her own son. But for the time being, the Buchanans took life a day at a time. With so much money coming in from the business, they could at least take solace in how comfortable they were. However, the family wasn't as financially stable as everyone thought, even though they seemed to be living a truly upper-class life. By 2014, the Buchanans had been through 8 years of fighting, making up, and fighting again. Adam was practically always the instigator. But Molly wasn't the type of person to just let a marriage fall apart. Her vows meant something to her, and she definitely wasn't going to risk leaving Nolan behind to face his father's abuse alone. Molly stayed with Adam, feeling she had no real alternative, as she was financially dependent on him and didn't want to leave Nolan alone with his father. She spent a lot of time at her mother's place, taking the kids with her whenever she went, but she always came back. It's important to note that she was financially tied to Adam, since she worked at the family business. Nolan had started working there just the previous year, with his father hoping to train him to become his successor. Basically, Molly and the kids had nowhere to go, and it's likely that Adam wanted it that way. As we've already said, the business wasn't doing so well. It was tens of thousands of dollars in debt, and a recent round of layoffs meant that it was operating with a skeleton crew. But Adam was the sort of person that loved to buy nice things. The Buchanans owned 2 vintage cars and even a pontoon boat that they took out on the water from time to time. How did he finance all this luxury? By taking on more and more debt. And in 2014, he took his unsustainable expenditures to a whole new level. He splurged on a whopping 19 acres in nearby Greenwood, complete with a cabin that was more of a rundown shack. It had no electricity or running water. But for someone like Adam, it was the perfect getaway from the hustle and bustle of city life. It was also a project he could work on, with the family heading out to the woods every so often to remodel and rework the structure. These forest getaways couldn't distract him from the truth, though. The Buchanan family was falling apart. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. To the casual observer, the Buchanan family couldn't have been doing any better in 2015. They had owned the Greenwood cabin for over a year, and neighbors were likely impressed by their flashy displays of wealth. But behind closed doors, Adam and Molly's relationship was the worst it had ever been. They fought constantly now, and with such rage that the police had to be called on several occasions. They no longer slept in the same bed, with Molly moving into a bedroom of her own, possibly after Adam got violent during one of their arguments. A journal that was later found by investigators showed that she was in a state of serious mental distress. She was caught in a bind, knowing Adam's control extended to their children and that leaving could mean losing her kids entirely. He'd also managed to get custody of Nolan after divorcing his first wife, which showed that he usually got what he wanted. Adam's manipulation had closed off every avenue for Molly's escape. She went to her mother's home as often as she could, but Adam had managed to gain control of every aspect of her life. He was her employer. He often had the final say in where her child could go, and he also owned the home Molly lived in. On September 11th, 2015, Adam suggested that the family go up to the Greenwood cabin for the weekend. It's possible that Molly was looking forward to the trip. Adam would be busy with his renovation project most of the time, allowing her to get some quality time with the kids. The cabin was also in a great spot for hunting, which was one of the things she and Adam had bonded over when they first met. She may have hoped that the cabin could offer a momentary reprieve from their troubled relationship. And so, the Buchanans headed out, not knowing that they'd never come home again. At around 10 a.m. on September 13th, 2 days after the Buchanans had traveled to the cabin, the local fire department got a call about a potential forest fire. They rushed to the scene and managed to put out the growing inferno, but at the center of it all, they found a pile of ashy rubble that looked like it had once been a cabin. The rubble was still warm to the touch, with pockets of it so hot that firefighters couldn't lift it if they tried. Once the debris cooled, they picked it apart and found charred bones hidden underneath. At first, everyone thought that the remains belonged to a wild animal that had wandered into the cabin, or perhaps the pet of a family that stayed there. But eventually, they found part of a chest bone and a piece of a skull with what looked like a bullet hole in it. There was no doubt about it. These were human remains. Police got involved and quickly discovered that the cabin belonged to Adam Buchanan, owner of a construction company in Benicia. They headed over to his home address, knocked on the door, and were greeted by Nolan. It turned out that he hadn't gone up to the cabin with his family. Instead, he'd stayed back so that he could spend the weekend with his girlfriend. He said that he expected his parents to return that very evening. Police then told Nolan that his family was missing and that there had been a fire. He responded that his parents fought a lot and they might have knocked something over to set the cabin ablaze. He also suggested that his little brother Gavin might have accidentally caused the fire. It was an oddly calm response from the 16-year-old. He hardly seemed worried at all. As police left, they noticed a white Ford F-150 parked in the driveway and wondered how the Buchanans got to the cabin without it. Police had several theories about what had happened. When they found Molly's journal and read about Adam's abuse, they surmised that he might have used his .22 caliber rifle to take her life and caused a fire in the process. But according to the medical examiner, none of the corpses showed signs of smoke inhalation, which meant that they were already dead when the fire broke out. No firearm was found at the scene of the crime. A cleanup of the area led police to the murder weapon, the .22 caliber rifle. It was found next to Molly's purse, indicating that the perpetrator had killed the family with Adam's gun and tried to dispose of the evidence nearby. They then tried looking into a disgruntled employee, since Adam was a notoriously demanding boss that frequently threw expletives at the people he worked for, but this turned out to be yet another dead end. While police tried to find the culprit, Nolan acted like he was on top of the world. He reportedly told his grandfather that he was happier than he'd ever been before, claiming that it was because he'd had such a good time with his girlfriend. He showed up to work at Buchanan Construction with a brand new sports coat, acting as if he didn't have a care in the world. He was more concerned with the company bank accounts than anything else, mentioning that he wanted to gain access to them as soon as possible. Nolan's strange behavior continued throughout that week. At a family lunch, he made some disturbing comments about inheriting the business and selling it for cash. He also went out and bought some new jewelry and clothes, which he was reportedly wearing when he met with Molly's mother. It didn't take long for police to start looking at Nolan as a suspect. Forensic analysis of the rifle revealed Nolan's fingerprints all over it, but this wasn't enough on its own. He might have handled the rifle at home, or at any point in the recent past. The presence of his fingerprints didn't automatically mean he'd killed his family. Even so, it provided a starting point for investigators, and they soon started closing in. Nolan knew that he'd become a suspect eventually, so he tried to throw the police off immediately. He told them about a neighbor that allegedly grew illegal substances in his backyard, and mentioned that his father often argued with the neighbor about this. Despite Nolan's misdirection, police started piecing things together once they got their hands on some surveillance footage, which they cross-referenced with Adam's credit card history. At around 9:17 p.m. on September 11th, Adam had swiped his credit card to pay for something at Taco Bell, likely while the family were on their way to the cabin. The interesting thing was, he'd bought 4 drinks and 4 cups were found in the cabin's debris. This suggested that Nolan was actually with them the whole time, since he was most likely the 4th individual. Hours later, at around 2:30 a.m., Adam withdrew $40 at a bar near the cabin. Surveillance footage showed him and Molly hanging out at the bar and captured them leaving in the Ford truck later on. All this footage confirmed that the family had used the truck to travel to the cabin. So how did it end up back at the house? The answer to this question lies in surveillance footage obtained for the next day. At around 3:30 a.m., the truck was seen driving towards the cabin. An hour later, a security camera captured it heading towards the interstate. Police surmised that Nolan was the one driving the car. Sometime in between 3:30 and 4:30 in the morning, he'd killed his family with his father's gun. He also seemingly had Adam's credit card because the transaction history showed purchases at McDonald's and Starbucks, among other places. After killing his family, he'd seemingly gone on a fast food run, and he'd continued using his deceased father's funds over the next few days. Nolan seemed ready to move on. He wanted to liquidate all company assets and blow the cash on flashy items, possibly taking a cue from his father's questionable spending habits. He wouldn't have long to enjoy this newfound wealth, and he probably didn't realize that he'd just inherited all that debt as well. Police still needed to poke holes in Nolan's alibi before they could bring him in, so they got in touch with his girlfriend. She said that Nolan had planned for them to hang out on Friday, but he canceled at the last minute. He then called her 2 days later, saying that he'd been at home alone all weekend. This was something he'd said to a number of people that day, possibly in an attempt to create an alibi for himself. Police now had all the information they needed. On October 1st, they headed over to Bonita High School where they arrested Nolan and charged him with 3 counts of murder. Nolan's trial began in April of 2018, and his lawyers argued that he'd acted in self-defense. They claimed that Adam was the true perpetrator of this crime, and based on how violent he'd been throughout his life, this was something that most people would have believed. And yet, Adam was clearly already dead when the cabin was set on fire. And even if Nolan acted in self-defense, it didn't explain why he calmly drove away and bought fast food right after such a traumatic event. For his part, Nolan tried everything to keep the blame from falling on him. He'd previously claimed that Molly was a substance abuser, and that this was the cause of the tension between her and Adam. When he took the stand, he decided to point the finger at his father instead. In his version of events, he was near the cabin when he heard gunshots, which supposedly came from Adam shooting Gavin in the head. Nolan headed back to the cabin, and a struggle ensued in which he accidentally shot his father. Molly was also apparently dead by this point, so Nolan decided to burn their bodies. Why he would do this instead of calling the police is a mystery, but it bears mentioning that this testimony was absolutely false. The prosecution laid out the series of events in such a way that the jury simply had to convict him. They showed evidence that Nolan had shot his younger brother in the head in a vicious fit of rage, after which he awaited for his parents to return. When they came back, he shot them as well and then doused the entire home in gasoline before setting it ablaze. The surveillance footage showing him driving away, coupled with the spending spree he went on, also worked against him. And on June 13th, he was declared guilty on all counts. Judge Suzanne Kingsbury sentenced him to 150 years in prison, with credit for the nearly 3 years he'd already spent in county jail. Due to Congress's limitations on sentencing for minors, he'll be eligible for parole in 25 years. It's possible that the judge wanted to give a minor the chance to get rehabilitated and then have the chance to re-enter society. But based on the cold-blooded nature of Nolan's actions, he might not have anywhere to go even if he gets paroled in 2039. No one in his family would want to take him in. It seems as though prison might be his final resting place after all. The judge's final words seem to sum it all up perfectly. Everybody has the capacity to change. I hope you do everything in your power to do so. So what do you think of this case? Did Nolan's age work in his favor during sentencing, or did he get the sentence he deserved? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.